You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Well, happy Friday evening, folks. It's actually Good Friday. So if you are a practitioner or a practicer or a follower of Christianity, today is a very important day for you. And welcome to the program. I'm Scotty Roberts. This is my show, the Intrepid radio program, heard right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. For those of you who are not there, go on over to Odyssey Radio and find out all the goodness that is Odyssey and also all the different outlets where you can hear this program. You can also, while you're listening tonight, go over to the simulcast in video over on my YouTube live stream. And that is youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. One of the best features over there, of course, is the chat room where all the Intrepheads gather to watch the show and to talk amongst themselves and talk about the show. So come on over, add your 2 cents worth, or see what's being discussed. Either way, welcome. And happy Good Friday. This is the day that tradition says Jesus of Nazareth was crucified on this day. And so if you celebrate that, this is a solemn day, but of course in Christianity, meant to be a very celebratory day. One of the few days where we celebrate the torturous, gruesome death of a spiritual leader, which according to Christian theology was meant to bring eternal salvation and life and light, the sacrifice, the Lamb of God on the cross for the sins of mankind. And so if you are in the school of mysticism or Gnosticism, you might also view this as a time where the story might be a true story. The literal theology behind it might be more symbolic than it is anything else, talking about the death and the burial and the resurrection. And we'll save that for another time to talk about that topic, as we've addressed that many times before in the past. But I want to, tonight, instead, I would rather carry on with our discussion about Druids and also their connection to Atlantis, if it really exists, and Atlantis itself. I've got a ton of information up here in front of me, so let's see what we can tackle tonight and maybe even get through tonight to a certain extent. Now, here is a big question that came up in some of what we were covering yesterday. Did the Druids actually share a common ancestry with other ancient religions? And remember, the Druids go back into about the 2400 BCE time slot when they're first recognized. And even Julius Caesar, as we mentioned yesterday in this little book that I have on his Gallic Wars, mentions the Druids. And there are really few groups in history that are more enigmatic than those that we know today as the Druids. Today there are 2 neo-Druid sects that are out there whose philosophy centers around this reverence for nature, diversity, and love. And these are often cloaked people known to perform ceremonies in nature and at megalithic sites like Stonehenge. As a matter of fact, the first time I was at Stonehenge, there was a gentleman there. He looked like a biker. You know, he had hair all over and big beard and tattoos and the leathers and things like that. And he held a big sword, his Excalibur, and he had a hand-drawn sign on it. And he said that he was the true King Arthur. Now, this guy was not a nut job. This was just part of his belief. He believed he was a reincarnation of Arthur, but he was also a druid. And it's interesting, I met him back in 1991, and just recently, in looking at some photos and reading some news of megalithic sites, I actually saw him in one of the photos, still carrying a similar sign, carrying his sword Excalibur, standing with his other followers who were cloaked, and he was wearing kind of knight's garb over his leathers, only all his hair had turned white, and the big white beard. So there are some believers out there in Neo-Druidism, which probably is only a shade of what actual Druidism was all about in antiquity. Because the Druids of antiquity, they're steeped in legend, in folklore. There's no written record of who they truly were or where they originally came from. Were they just the Celts who decided that we're going to form this religious, it's not really a sect, this religious organization that also served to be kind of a theocratic ruling system over what they did? It was a religious system. Is this where they came from? They just formulated? The general consensus holds that they were a highly revered group with divine connections to nature and authoritative wisdom that trumped even the highest nobility, and they were widely known to be of Celtic origin. But some alternative theories seem to have them having this common ancestry with ancient Eastern cultures, or even one possibly originating in Atlantis. Now, Atlantis, we talked about that a bit last night. There is the mythical side of Atlantis, the fanciful, the fantasy, the science fiction side, and there is more than likely the historical, literal side of Atlantis, being part of an island culture that was, science fiction tells you they were more advanced than we are today. Probably not technologically, but did this island exist? Did this small continent exist in the middle of the Atlantic? So we'll maybe look into that a little bit more tonight. In ancient times, Druids were known as wise elders who would congregate around oak groves. And in fact, the word druid or druid, W-I-D in Celtic, translates to oak knower or knowing the oak tree. It's kind of like Elohim, the name for God in the Old Testament, meaning not just God, but God of many gods. And so all the different names that shot off of that, Elohim, El Shaddai, El Elyon, and so on. So the Druids were the knowers, the knowing of the oak tree, though little is known exactly what this erudite group was really like. They're recorded in history, the ancient Druids typically, and they fall into two different categories. Those that were based on ancient Roman writings, and those based on interpretations of writings, seen as distorted Roman propaganda about them. So the Celtic Druids inhabited the area of Europe once known as Gaul, where they were eventually conquered by the Romans. And one of the best written accounts of the Druids came from Julius Caesar, who described them, and we read that yesterday in this little book, and I would highly recommend looking this up, Caesar's Gallic Wars. You can find this, but I found this book for a dime at a thrift store here in town. I paid 10 cents for it, and it's a 1896 edition of Caesar's Gallic Wars, and we read a section from that. But from what Julius Caesar said about them, he described them as civilized, as wise, noble people, with the exception of their alleged ritual human sacrifice. This is what Caesar wrote about. And Caesar and Tacitus led the conquering of Gaul and the subsequent persecution of the Druids, and they viewed them as overly superstitious and having a dictatorial control on society. And the Druid religion was said to have sacrificed criminals in massive wooden effigies. If you ever get a chance, watch the original, not the Nicolas Cage. Sorry, Nicolas Cage. Always liked you, but His remake of this movie didn't quite make it in my book, but the original Wicker Man, that was made in the 60s with Christopher Lee and Edward Woodward. You'll want to go get that movie and take a look at it, or look it up and see if you can find it anywhere online, or any of the Netflix or something. An excellent movie where they're talking about these massive wooden effigies. And they were known as Wicker Men, which was filled with people and animals and goods and all kinds of things, and set on fire. Now, Caesar claimed that the Gauls were so consumed by the superstitions of the Druidic rituals that they were quick to sacrifice, and they'd even offer up innocent people if they lacked sufficient criminals. And by criminals sometimes, it was sometimes people that they had captured in battle, and they treated them very well up until the point where they lit them on fire. But they sort of honored them and said, "You are our honored conquered, and you will die in ritual sacrifice for the good of our people." And so when they lacked sufficient, they said they burned innocents. And many really contest this image of the Druids as an inaccurate attempt by Caesar to depict them as a society worth integrating into Roman culture, albeit one that needed civilizing. So they considered, even though Caesar wrote about them as being a people who were civilized and wise and noble, he felt that they needed Roman civilization. And so he wanted to appropriate them into the Roman rule. And so unlike most religious and spiritual beliefs in Europe during the time, Druids believed in reincarnation. They believed our souls were immortal and could be reborn into different life forms. Druid religion believed that there were two planes of existence, the world we experience now and the other world. And some think the Druids believed our souls would live and die in this world and then live and die in the other world, trading lifetimes in kind of this cyclical process. And so numerous schools trained noble youth to become Druids, depending on which type of role one was trained in. And the Druidic educational system could take up to 20 years. Now, I suppose that's not so unlike our kindergarten through graduating from college. You're looking at a good 16 years there. But a significant schooling when life expectancy didn't extend much past the age of 40. 20 years was a lot of time to go to school. Still, it was considered highly esteemed to become a Druid. And despite the patriarchal nature of that era, women were made Druidesses with equal roles to men. There was an equality within Druidism. And the Druids worshipped female goddesses. And a Druidess could take part in battle. She could divorce her husband. So they were allotted the same equal rights as a man. So there were three roles that a Druid in training could aspire to: a prophet, a priest, or a bard. Now there's a great book out there, and I want to say Morgan Llewellyn wrote it, but I might be wrong. But it was a book, I read it 20 years ago, a book called Bard. And it's all about a young man who becomes a bard in the Druidic tradition in ancient times. Well worth picking up. Just look up the title, Bard. It's a good novel if you like reading novels. So at school, in the Druidic school, all the lessons were taught and memorized through lore. Song, poetry, storytelling was of utmost importance, as Druids kept no written records, instead encoding their teachings into folk tales. This is what we were talking about when we were talking about mystery language, being in symbols and parables and allegories and fables. And so this is a part of the reason the bards were so necessary in Druidism, as their songs served not just as historical record, but were also thought to have magical powers, including the ability to induce sleep, to change moods, and even cause illness or death. Now, in modern Druidism, nowadays, Neo-Druidism, if you will, Today, the practice of modern Druidism is alive and well in two different branches of Neo-Druidism. The Druid Order was the most well-known contemporary society of modern Druids until the early 60s, when a new order known as the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, the OBOD, was established. And this division was since gained notoriety across the world, claiming a 20,000-person membership. Now, I have a friend, his name is Lon Milo Duquette. Now, we're not like best buddies or anything. We're friends. He spoke as the keynote speaker at the last Paradigm Symposium I put on in 2016. And he is the head of the, I can never get this straight, as millions of times it seems I've looked it up, the Ordo Templi Orientis. And he is also writes several books on modern Western witchcraft. And he is not a dark person at all. When I mention witchcraft, you think, ooh, no, this is not it at all. This is Druidic tradition. And he is also kind of a folk singer. He writes songs, plays his guitar, he puts some videos every now and then. I watch his music. I love his stuff. And he also played at the Paradigm Symposium. But this would be in the tradition of a modern bard, in the Druidic tradition, within the tradition that he falls. And so the OBOD runs online mentorships, they run classes, workshops to develop its three disciplines described as a spiritual practice that speaks to creativity, nature, and wisdom. You can go check them out, the OBOD. Go look for them online. And the three categorizations of OBOD are alternatively described as the singer, the shaman, and the sage. And the Druid Order is known for the ceremonies conducted at Stonehenge throughout the year during solstices and equinoxes. This is the Neo-Druids. And they've conducted these for over a century, and they look to the cycle of the seasons as a regulator and a key to unlock inner harmony. And they see modern Druidic beliefs not as a religion, but more as a fraternity or an esoteric society that accepts all religions. They also pride themselves in observing and minding their own business. And they only, when asked for advice, will a member of the Druid Order give his opinion. However, I do remember I watched this show. This may sound like not an exciting show to some of you. I think I've mentioned it at least once before, but it's a show I really like watching. And I find it on YouTube, the series. If you remember Tony Robinson, many people who watched the Blackadder with Rowan Atkinson, and his sidekick was Tony Robinson, who played Baldric, the idiot servant to Blackadder. That's how many people recognize him from that show in the 80s. And but he is an archaeologist, and he has a show that he ran in Great Britain for a good 20-plus years called Time Team. And it's where they would go to, he and other archaeologists, they would go to sites in Great Britain, lots of Roman sites, but they would find these archaeological sites, and they would dig, and they'd have 3 days that they'd do it, and they'd try to uncover history. And he had many other historical shows, walking through Great Britain, the great paths and old roads, ancient roads of Great Britain. And so Tony Robinson, he was eventually knighted by Queen Elizabeth for all that he has done to contribute to British society through his historical and archaeological work. But the reason I bring him up, I took all that time to say that, they found in the ocean, as it would recede in low tide, they found old stumps, and they found that there was a pattern to them. And as they did some ground-penetrating radar, they found that this was an old, what they assumed to be a Druidic site, or at least an old ceremonial site from ancient times. We're talking thousands of years old. And these tree stumps retained their, they didn't rot away in the salt water and under the silt that had gathered. And so they dug some of this stuff out, and they took it out so it would be preserved forever for humanity before it was gone. And there was a Neo-Druidic, this is the point I was going to get to, a Neo-Druidic sect that came and protested. Now, don't think of protest in this sense in the way of, screaming at people or anything. They just stood and watched. And one of them spoke up and said he believed it should be left alone. And but this is the kind of thing that you see with the modern Druids. So one of the basics of the Druid beliefs, or Druidic beliefs, is the idea of Awen, A-W-E-N, Awen, or the divine inspiration. It's otherwise described as gnosis. Think of, again, everything from all our studies on Gnosticism and the mysteries come rushing in right now. It's known as the gnosis, Awen, or the intuitive wisdom that's derived from the practice of Druidism. I remember when I was in the church, there was I don't remember why, there was a week where I wasn't feeling so well and I was down and under, and I had a visit from some of the elders of the church who just came by to visit and say hi. And I was working at home. This is a good 20 years ago, or mid-90s. And on my bookshelf in the living room, one of the guys kind of wrinkled his nose. He was looking at my collection of books. And I have thousands of books, but the ones I had out on that particular shelf were books on Druidism, and books on modern witchcraft, and books on different types of religion of that nature. And he said, "Why do you have those books?" He says, "I think that that's like the devil working in your home." And so that's the view that modern literalist Orthodox Christianity would take of these things. And so it's thought to be unique in every individual, this Awen, this gnosis. And it's described, and really kind of, I want to ask you to dig into yourself with this, the way I've asked before, where I say, separate yourself, be in the now, be aware, be awake, be in the moment, and look at yourself. This Awen, this gnosis, is described as poetic inspiration. Awen is used to describe the poetry used by the bards to pass down the story of the Druids. And there's modern usage describes poets and musicians in the very same way. And the symbol of Awen is depicted by 3 rays representing harmony and universal balance. This is, I think, a good practice when we meditate, which I'm very bad at. I'm not good at that because my mind gets too analytical, and sometimes there's just no private time to do it. But if you can take the time, look inward and think about this. Ask for a revealing of the Awen, of the gnosis, of knowing, and be in the moment and look for that. And I think that this was an important part of Druidism, and still is an important part, I think, of humanity today, that we have let slide. And this is what the Druids really capitalized on. Now, I've got about a minute left in this segment, but there's some theories that the ancient Druids built Stonehenge, given their reverence for it, in modern times, as well as other sacred monolithic sites. And the idea was first posited by John Aubrey in 1640, and later perpetuated by William Stuckley. And though this theory has supposedly been discredited as radiocarbon dating, shown the stones back to 3100 BC, while the knownest history of the Druids began around 300 BC. However, there are some that believe it goes back as far as 2400 BCE. So still there's no definitive proof or credible theory as to who built Stonehenge, and that's been widely accepted, leading some to believe that an ancient sect of Druids may have in fact constructed the site. And this is where the Atlantean connection starts to come in. Are these a remnant of Atlantean culture? And so in more esoteric beliefs, an alleged group of ancient Druids from Atlantis were thought to have possibly constructed Stonehenge using some exotic or possibly even anti-gravity technology, which I doubt. However, there's a lot to be said for magic. Now, we'll get into that in the second segment, so you sit tight. We got to go out to break. We'll be right back. right, gang, we're back from the break. Thanks for sitting tight. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. Go on over to odysy1.com to see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. You can also join this broadcast in its video simulcast over on my YouTube channel. And that's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Jump into the chat room over there. You'll enjoy meeting some of the personalities and the other Intrepheads and have a good discussion of this topic while the show is playing. So you can also find all my show archives over there. So go on over and join my YouTube channel, Mr. Scotty Roberts, and subscribe. I'd greatly appreciate that. Now, we left off in the first segment talking about Stonehenge, who built it. There's theories out there that say the ancient Druids built it, but Stonehenge goes way farther back than most accept as the origin date of the Druids. Yet, there is a pre-Druidic culture that is believed to have existed as far back as almost 3000 BCE, which is about the time Stonehenge was built. So was this built by common folks as a religion, or a religious or a ceremonial spiritual spot? Or was this an alleged group of ancient Druids from Atlantis who were thought to have possibly constructed Stonehenge using wild technology, anti-gravity technology, and so on? Now, you can enter into some of the lore of, take Merlin, the legendary wizard in Arthurian lore. He's sometimes credited as being responsible for moving the 10 to 20 ton stones transported hundreds of miles to build Stonehenge. But some believe Merlin to have been a Ferelite druid named Taliesin, and he practiced magical alchemy, or who possessed anti-gravity technology. Now, that technology, you could also, you could look at that as the magical ability to be able to levitate stone. Now, there's no way to prove that nowadays. I don't see anybody out there who practices neo-druidism who has the magical ability to levitate 10 to 20 ton stones and create a structure. So maybe with the exception of the Coral Castle down in Florida, that guy did some pretty wild things. But was that all geometry and all modern technology? Don't know. So the Ferelite was an esoteric sect of Druidism, sometimes alluded to by bards. Its eponymous esoteric text, the Lost Book of Ferelite, is thought to detail this common origin between many of the major ancient civilizations. The Ferelite, I'm saying Ferelite, it's Pherylit, or LLT. It's the Ferelite. Were said to have arrived in Wales after the sinking of Atlantis, and they share many similarities in their beliefs with Eastern Dharmic religions. Now, I might as well show you this right now. Atlantis, I've got an old map that was drawn. I believe this is from the 1600s. Let's look at this. This is a map of what was thought to have been the Atlantean continent. And here you see, right in the middle, Atlantis, it says. It talks about the dolphin, and it talks about the Dolphin Ridge, and these different locations. Number one, way up at the top, on the upper left of the Atlantean continent. Why am I having a tough word remembering the word continent this morning? You see that brushes up almost against Ireland. You have a number, that's at number 1. At number 4 there, you see it's the Canary Islands. And this is what brushes up right against the Pillars of Hercules, or the Straits of Gibraltar, where Spain comes down and meets, I think it's Morocco there, at the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea. And you've got the Azores are right in there as well. And then, of course, over on the The far side, number 3, the Caribbean Wall. This is where you get things like the Bimini Road and things like that come into play. So this is the continent that was thought to be Atlantis thousands of years ago. And so it is thought that the peoples who were the remnant of the sinking of Atlantis or the flooding of Atlantis, that those people eventually migrated over to Wales. And this is how it spread into the Celtic culture. And so the connections between Druidism, when we talk about the Eastern Dharmic religions possibly being their roots, the connections between Druidism and Hinduism are particularly striking. There's one similarity is found in the Druids' sacred Awen, which looks and sounds much like the Hindu word Aum. And both words are representing the primordial sound of the universe, a frequency. And the Fairlit also spoke of a female goddess, Ceridwen, who shares many parallels with the Hindu goddess Kali. And Ceridwen's divine feminine energy is often referred to much like Kali's Kundalini energy. And so, big question still exists. Could there have been a common Atlantean origin or an ancestry between the Celtic Druids and other ancient Eastern cultures? There are similarities in mythology aside, there are also many parallels in their belief systems, including reincarnation and cosmology. And interestingly, the root words for druid, dru, and vid, when translated in Sanskrit, mean immersed in knowledge. And it's also been common for many modern Druids to feel a connection with the Dharmic teachings of these Eastern religions, leading members of OBOD to actively study this connection. And there's so much information out there on this. I really encourage you to go take a look at some of this. Go look at the OBOD and see what it is they have to teach, and look at their schooling. I look at right now. I've got a little site up in front of me, druidry.org, and you can look at Druidism and the ancient religions of India. And the very name Druid is composed of 2 Celtic word roots, which have parallels in Sanskrit. And indeed, the root word vid, as we just mentioned, for knowledge, which also emerges in the Sanskrit word Veda, demonstrates the similarity. The Celtic root word dru, which means immersion, also appears in Sanskrit. So a druid was one who was immersed in knowledge. And many followers of Druidry today, they feel this strong affinity with one or more of the religions of India. And the research shows that this feeling may be based upon more than simply a sense of spiritual resonance. And there's now this considerable evidence that suggests that Celtic and European cultures share a common origin with cultures that emerged in India thousands of years ago, and which gave birth to the Dharmic religions of Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism. And spiritual seekers who find their inspiration in both Druidism and Dharmic religions may well be reuniting strands of common cultural and spiritual heritage. And again, the Order of Bards and Ovates and Druids, the OBOD, jointly with the International Center for Cultural Studies, has initiated the One Tree Project. It's a research program to explore these connections. And the One Tree Project, I'm just going to go over there. I want to see what this is about. The One Tree Project, it's known as the One Tree Gathering. It explores and celebrates the idea that Eastern Indian, dot no feather, and European culture share this common origin. In particularly, they're inspired by the thought that Celtic and Druid culture might share the same source as Dhammic cultures of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. And the project's goals are to explore this subject in 2 ways. One is through cultural exchange. At One Tree gatherings, members of the Druid and Dharmic communities come together to explore their similarities and their differences, to expand their horizons and educate themselves by learning from each other. And number 2 is to foster scholarship and research on the subject of this shared origin. Now, I stop and think, what an interesting thing a gathering like that would be to attend. Yet there is a small nervousness, anxiety. It's not anxiety because it's not a worry. It's a apprehension within me to think, boy, if I joined one of those gatherings just to see what it was all about, would it just come across as a bunch of weirdo New Agers? I don't know for sure. But if they are truly steeped in the ancient traditions, and we see this, the traditions of spiritism, or the spirit nature, the Awen, all of this stuff, the gnosis, the knowledge, the knowing, the understanding, that could be an interesting place to be. So when I go from here, we start looking for, I could get back into, what we were talking about yesterday, into that particular, I was looking at Atlantis, the antediluvian world, which antediluvian means just pre-flood world, the ancient world. And you can look at that when you start thinking about the Druids and their connection to Atlantis. And you can talk about this whole issue of Atlantis being myth or reality. And did the Druids actually come from Atlantis? Did they find their source point in Atlantean culture? So get out of your mind the idea of Atlantis being this science fiction realm where there were modern glass and steel buildings and flying vehicles and levitation of a technological sort anyway. I think that there was a lot of magics involved. You're talking about ancient mankind. And I wonder how closely connected, and I don't know this, I haven't researched this, I'm just speculating here now, places like Göbekli Tepe in northeastern Turkey, how that 12,000-year-old site can tie into possible connections to ancient Atlantean culture. So this would have existed thousands of years before the destruction of Atlantean culture, or the rise of Druidism, which was still all in the ancient past. When you think of 12,000 years ago, you're talking 9,000 BCE, when the emergence of the Druids was as early as 2400 BCE, and the destruction of Atlantis possibly as early as the 3000s BC. So, now, I don't have much doubt that Atlantis existed, or its location, as I showed you the map a little earlier. And sorry, those of you who were on the radio and did not see that graphic I put up, just a hand-drawn map of basically taking up most of the space of the Atlantic Ocean was a continent. And some of the islands, like the Azores and the Canary Islands, places like that, are all remnants of what was left after the continent flooded or was sunk. And so the possibility of culture surviving post-flood, when you get a biblical take on the flood of Noah and the ark, you have one religious view of what the great flood was all about. One of them, anyway. You look into the Gilgamesh epic, and you see something different. You look into epic stories of great deluges in other cultures and religions, and you see something different altogether. So, was there more than Noah and his family, according to the biblical tale, that survived the flood? Were there other cultures that survived the flood? If you remember, Nephilim culture was said to have been in existence before the flood and also afterward, it says in the biblical text. So they survived the flood as well. Is this where we find guys like McKenna who talk about ancient Nephilim culture and remnants of it all over Ireland, all over Scotland, all over Gaul? That some of these structures, these ancient monolithic structures and sites and old cities that are uncovered that are thousands of years old are possibly Nephilim culture. That's a study, that's a show all by itself. But so when we say we know the location, that's if you kind of settle it in your mind. You say, okay, I have an understanding that this continent existed and that there are remnants of it, and we can pretty much know where it was. And so after all these decades and possibly centuries studying Atlantis, I think we've come to some ideas about where it is and what it is. When we have the sinking of the island of Thera, which is modern Santorini, in the Aegean Sea about 1500 BC. If small islands can rise and sink, why not something on a grander scale? We do know that there was such a thing as continental drift. And it's said that that took place millions of years ago. Yet you have books like the Book of Job in the Old Testament. If you lend veracity to this, you've got the Book of Job in the Old Testament, which is considered to be the oldest chronological book in the Old Testament. And that book, sorry, folks, those of you on the radio, you don't get to see this. I've got a young child coming in to say hello. Hi, Daddy's on radio.
Can I have a donut?
You can have a donut. Okay, there you go. Pardon. Goodbye. Shut my door. Bye. That's my youngest, my 5-year-old, Ellery. So those of you on the radio didn't get a chance to see her. She came in with scraggly hair, and she would like to have a donut. And so pardon that familial interlude. Let's get back into what we were talking about. See, nothing is private here. I office in my home. I do my radio from my home. The older kids and my wife, they all know. My wife will sneak in sometimes to get to her office over there. And the older kids will sneak in and grab something and sneak out. The little one opens the door. Hey, Dad, can I have a donut? No matter what I'm doing. So when I'm not on radio, it's fine. When I'm on radio, and after all the times I've told the 5-year-old, when Daddy's doing radio, you got to stay out. It doesn't work. I put up my hand when she came in, and she just ignored it. So that's the little queen of the universe, by the way. So even in I was talking about the Book of Job, the oldest chronological book in the Bible, older than any of the other books written. It mentions, there's an obscure little phrase in one of the verses, and I don't have it in front of me. I'm just doing this from memory. There's a verse where Job talks about in the days when the earth was moved. And in the Hebrew language, it actually makes reference to what we could consider continental drift. And so that book is thousands of years old. So take that or leave it. So, but there are entrenched attitudes that say that you can't have a sinking of a continent like that. Whereas I think that there is some geographical proof that this has all taken place. So there are ancient accounts of Atlantis, and the earliest known accounts are given by Plato. And we saw in Plato's Timaeus, where he talks about Atlantis and Egyptian culture eventually being linked to it. And there's other reasons for the paucity of ancient accounts of Atlantis, and not least the wholesale destruction of so many books and manuscripts by the various invaders of Egypt over many millennia. And where was Atlantis? We ask. In Plato's description of Atlantis, we mentioned this yesterday, is as follows. In the front of the mouth, which you Greeks call the Pillars of Hercules, that's the Straits of Gibraltar, there lay an island which was larger than Libya and Asia combined, and it was possible for the travelers of that time to cross from it to the other islands, and from other islands to the whole of the continent over against them, which encompasses the real ocean, which could very possibly be America. And so that's to me, that's some very interesting stuff. So it's really quite impossible to make any maps which provide an accurate picture of what Atlantis looked like at specific times in the past. We only have to think of the many changes that have altered the size and appearance of, say, London or New York or any places that we know today to get a picture of what Atlantis may have looked like at specific times in the past. And we only have to think of the many changes that have altered the size and the appearance of things that we know of today. And so you put into account 9,000 years, 6,000 years, 5,000 years, things are going to look a little different. And then there was this wisdom of Atlantis. In Ignatius Donnelly's book, Atlantis, you read this: in religion, the Atlanteans had reached all the great thoughts which underlie our modern creeds. They had attained to the conception of one universal, omnipotent, great first cause. End quote. Now, nowhere are these elevated thoughts better illustrated than the Oriolinda book, which we mentioned yesterday. It's a controversial book that went largely unnoticed until it was translated into English by William Sandbach in 1876. And here's the wisdom of the Atlantis that was put forward in this book. Where they got this wisdom is unknown. Is it passed down wisdom? Is it something that actually existed? They must have been in the northern parts of Atlantis, Ald land, or the Old Land, where the Frisians fled when it was destroyed. And it was the wisdom of Atlantis in this book was inscribed upon the citadels and the round towers, which were raised in every major city in ancient Friesland. And so here's something that says, it says, Wralda, W-R-A-L-D-A, Wralda, is all in all, for he is eternal and everlasting. Wralda is omnipresent but invisible, and therefore called a spirit. All that we can see of him are the created beings who come to life through him, and go again, because from Wralda all things proceed and return to him. Wralda is the beginning and the end. But although everything is derived from Wralda, the wickedness of men does not come from him. Wickedness comes from heaviness, carelessness, and stupidity. Therefore they may well be injurious to men, but never to Wralda. Wralda is wisdom, and the laws that he has made are the books from which we learn, nor is any wisdom to be found or gathered but in them. Men may see a great deal, but Wralda sees everything. Is this the basis for? Was this the proto-religion that may have existed prior to Judaism, Abrahamic religions, and even Christianity, obviously? Could one find a better description of the creator of all? What are some of the other good things that we can find in this book? And it was condemned, by the way, on its publication as an impudent imposture by all the best critics. Another quote from the book says, which is supposed to be Atlantean wisdom passed down, prosperity awaits the free. Though him only can I recognize as free who is neither a slave to another nor to himself. This is why my counsel, when in dire distress, and when mental and physical energy avail nothing, when have recourse to the spirit of Waldra, but do not appeal to him before you have tried all other means, for I tell you beforehand, and time will prove its truth, that those who give way to discouragement sink under their burdens. Now, there's a lot of truisms in those words, a lot of psychological truisms in those words, let alone theological. We all know people who sink under their burdens in just this way. And for the reasons given, and how many can truthfully say that they're not slaves to themselves? You know, I hear people now, because of the quarantining, the self-isolation, everybody, and the complaining is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but saying, you know, I haven't had a haircut for a month, you know, and there's this, my eyebrows have grown out, or I had one guy I saw this morning that's so worried about this stuff. He said, I'm touching my face every time, and he has a handlebar mustache, and he was using wax to wax the tips of his mustache. And he said, I was so worried about putting my hands to my face every day that I finally shaved my face, and, so I'm going to go bald-faced for a while till this is over. And I think he's a slave to himself. Because you know what? I touch my face every day. But I don't touch my face after I've gone outside and touched all kinds of other things in the public. I don't do that. I have clean hands, pure heart. I have clean hands, and then I touch my face. I trim my mustache or put wax in it or whatever. And so, there you go. And I'm not out and about, so I don't have to keep touching my face and hair all day long. So, I'm going to need a haircut soon. But there's this thing called personal grooming. Folks, there is personal grooming. You can do, I don't cut my own hair, but I certainly trim my hair back a little bit, and I take care of my facial hair and stuff like that. I wash my face. I use my hands to do it. So the question, and I've gone off on a little stupid rabbit trail there, but how many can truthfully say that they're not slaves to themselves? Or slaves to greed, slaves to selfishness, to jealousy, to envy, to anger, ambition, and all the other desires of the lower self and the lowly evolved, which keep mankind in ignorance of the greater spiritual truths of life. And here's the practical wisdom. We've got to end on this because we're at the end of our time. But practical wisdom of the northern parts of Atlantis, as it is said, was applied in daily life by looking at just a few of the principal laws of the Frisians. It says, all freeborn men are equal, wherefore they must all have equal rights on sea and land and on all that Waldra has given. Every man may seek the wife of his choice. Every woman may bestow her hand on him whom she loves. When a man takes his wife, a house and a yard must be given him. If there is none, one must build for him. To every man must be given a piece of land behind his house. No man shall have land in front of his house. Still less an enclosure, unless he has performed some public services. In such a case it may be given, and the youngest son may inherit it, but after him it returns to the community. Every village shall have a marketplace. All the rest of the land shall be for tillage and forest. No one shall fell trees without the consent of the community, or without the knowledge of the forester, for the forests are general property, and no man can appropriate them. There shall be no usurers in the market. That's money lenders who charge you exorbitant fees. And if any should come, it will be the duty of the maidens to make it known through the whole land, in order that such people may not be chosen for any office, because they're hard-hearted. For the sake of money, they would betray everybody, the people, the mother, their nearest relations, and even their own slaves. Practical wisdom of personal rights, supposedly, according to this author, came from Atlantean culture that was passed down to us. We'll examine this more a little bit tomorrow. We're out of time. We got to go. Sit tight. We'll see you on Monday with more of this. Don't forget Sunday morning, 9 a.m. Central Time for It's Sunday, right here on my YouTube channel. Have a good weekend, folks.